You're listening to episode 250 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Lama Tsomo joins us to speak about her book, Why is the Dalai Lama Always Smiling? A Westerner's Introduction and Guide to Tibetan Buddhist Practice. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes Store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. We have such a wide range of learning and practice opportunities with Buddhism in contemporary Western culture. It may even be a bit bewildering, having so much to choose from, that we find ourselves in need of not just texts of doctrine, but guidance and insight about what a particular tradition might mean to us as contemporary Westerners. Born into a Midwestern Jewish household, Lama Tsomo followed a path of spiritual inquiry that ultimately led her to ordination as one of the few American female lamas teaching Tibetan Buddhism. She now speaks Tibetan fluently and has done extensive spiritual retreats in both the U.S. and abroad, deepening her understanding and mastery of Tibetan Buddhism under the tutelage of Tulku Sangak Rinpoche, a primary holder of the Namchak lineage of Tibetan Buddhism and spiritual head of the Namchak Foundation. Rinpoche has asked Lama Tsomo to oversee the planning and construction of the Namchak Retreat Ranch, and she does so through her service on the board of the Namchak Foundation, an educational resource for a national learning community. Special thanks to Kate Cooney and Rob Nissan for their coordination of today's interview. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice pocha. My guest today is Lama Tsomo. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So very glad to have you here. I've really enjoyed the book that we're here to talk about, but I'd like to start by having you tell us a bit about your background. What brought you into this practice?
Well, I had a sort of a meandering path to this practice. I was in my mid-40s before I sort of stumbled my way into a Tibetan Buddhist practice, and stumbling into the Lama who sort of took me under his wing and adopted me as his first American guinea pig. So it was definitely a long and winding road. Starting from childhood, really, just I had this burning interest in understanding how reality works and what truth was, and how the mind worked, how my mind worked, and I was fascinated watching people and how they worked. And so I studied psychology to try and understand all of that. And although there was a burning desire about that, there was also, honestly, a burning desire to be happy and to be a better, happier person. I wasn't always happy, and my methods of pursuing happiness, which everybody constantly is pursuing happiness in one way or another and trying to push away suffering. I was discovering that I wasn't very good at either. And, despite my best efforts, I often wasn't happy. And, the things that I was worried about actually came to pass, and the worrying didn't seem to help. So I was looking for, better methods to handle all that. And I started with Western psychology, which was kind of a natural thing since I'm a Westerner. And I studied Gestalt, Jungian, body-centered psychotherapy. I got a master's degree in counseling psych and open to practice, and was helping other people, with the best methods that I had found. And I was helped by all those things, but it seemed kind of inefficient. And so I was still searching. And along the way, I had somehow gotten the idea in my mind that meditation was a good idea, but I had no idea how to do it. And I was living in a very rural place, and there were more cows than people and absolutely no meditation masters, and the cows weren't explaining anything. So I, kind of just started anyway, just doing like 15 minutes a day. And I thought, well, I'm not doing myself any good. First of all, I had all kinds of misconceptions about what meditation was, and I thought I was supposed to go into some kind of blissful state, and my brain would turn off, and I would suddenly have all these wonderful, blissful experiences. And neither of those things happened. My brain did not turn off, and I did not have amazing, blissful experiences. So I thought, well, I'm just terrible at this thing called meditation, and I'm not doing myself any good. I'll just stop. So then I stopped for 5 years. And so this was my own personal experiment in meditating and not meditating, or meditating badly and not meditating at all, I think is probably the more accurate representation. And I discovered that not meditating was worse than meditating badly, because I wanted to live a meaningful life. And it turns out that when you don't come to yourself every day, even for just a few minutes, then you never quite are listening to that little voice inside, your true self that is there all the time probably, but we're not there to hear it. So after 5 years of not being there to hear it, I got pretty off track as far as being with kind of the people that weren't for me, and being in a place that wasn't for me, and doing stuff that wasn't really for me. And I sort of woke up to it one day and went, oh my gosh, I'm really off track. I think I need to resume meditation, but maybe I should do with meditation what I did with piano, which is to find somebody who knows what they're doing and take lessons and practice every day. So there's a novel idea. So I began doing that. And by that time, I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and it's a wonderful place to check out the spiritual smorgasbord.
Beautiful city, wonderful community.
Yeah. And absolutely. So I began sort of checking things out, and I just began meditating anyway in the meanwhile. And I sort of sounded out the note, sort of calling my teacher. And I wanted to get very specific about it. So I actually wrote down on a piece of paper the qualifications that I was looking for. I wanted to be very specific so that as I was looking, sort of out of the corner of my eyes, I would recognize somebody who fit the description I was looking for. So I, listed all these qualifications. One thing that wasn't on the list was must speak English. Oops. So then I found myself lucky enough to have dinner with Ram Dass. And this was before his stroke. So we had a lovely conversation. I asked him, I said, I don't know what flavor, to pursue with meditation teachers, but I want instruction. What would you recommend as a type of practice to do? And very quickly he said, Dzogchen. And I said, what is that? What? How do you spell that?
Say again, what was it?
Yeah, I had no idea. So I, wrote it on a piece of paper and then promptly forgot about it, strangely enough. I don't know why that happened, but then I stumbled onto this the Tibetan tradition through an American Lama. I was very lucky that way. And I asked him a bunch of questions. This was after I had already done Theravada for over a year and then Zen for over a year. And they were great, but they weren't quite, I was trying them on for size and it wasn't quite my size, it wasn't quite fitting me. And so it's like, okay, we're getting warm here, but not quite it. And so then this Tibetan tradition, American Lama, what he was saying was really appealing to me. I thought, this might be it, but the only way I'll know is to just try the methods and road test them. So he gave me the Mundro, which is the preliminary practices to do. And so I was doing those, and I thought, well, I should try a retreat. So I went to his little tiny retreat place in outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Rinpoche happened to come there, Tuku Sangak Rinpoche, who ended up becoming my teacher. But at the time, I didn't realize, oh, this is my teacher. And it just so happens that he is one of the best Dzogchen masters around. So, I did just kind of stumble my way into that one. And I didn't know that this was my teacher at that time. I didn't quite, catch that. Then the American Lama wanted some teachings from this Tibetan Lama, Tuku Sangak Rinpoche. And by that time, he didn't have that little center anymore. So he said, can we use your house? And I said, sure. And he said, and you can get teachings from him too. And I'm like, okay.
That's great work if you can get it.
Yeah. And so the next thing I knew, here is my teacher on my doorstep. Kind of amazing. And then I realized while he was there, oh my gosh, this is the teacher for me. And it was just, clear recognition. So he gave me, more instruction, and I was finding these practices more and more rewarding. I was happier and happier, which is, a telling sign. And I was, better, happier person. I was, telling you before, that's what I was pursuing. And I was finding that I was able to handle life's challenges better. And friends and even my ex-husband were giving me positive feedback for my changes. So I thought, okay, this really is working for me, and this teacher is for me. And so I ended up learning Tibetan so I could communicate directly with him and learn a lot of the very specific terms and so on about states of mind and states of being, which it was just fascinating to learn all that stuff.
It's terrific to hear the rest of that, and you talk about much of this in the book. And as we were discussing before we started the interview itself, it's interesting how people will resonate or connect with certain traditions or parts of traditions and different contexts of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly okay. We would expect that in the complexity of being human.
Yes, although I want to make one little caveat. When you say parts of traditions, we need to be careful, because sometimes we Americans in particular can do some mixing and matching that can end up with mixing and mushing instead.
Cafeteria spirituality.
Is that what you call it?
Yeah, where you're doing a mix and match. And the risk with that, I agree with you, is that we may tend to just grab the desserts, the nummy delicious stuff we're looking forward to, and not go into the areas that might be a little more challenging for us, that are there to challenge us.
Well, that's absolutely, that's one thing. Also, a particular practice may need to be in context. For example, there are practices that I learned that the Lama who's worth their salt will not teach you until you've done other practices to lead up to that. It would be like trying to teach somebody trigonometry before they learned multiplication, for example.
Absolutely. Great
example. You can't skip multiplication.
Yeah, great way to demonstrate that. Absolutely. And it's how various traditions have much to offer that may seem perplexing to us as contemporary Westerners. They may seem very odd. And it's only when we really unpack them and explore them and try them, and we may not even see how they mutually support one another and the dependence they have on one another.
Well said. And this is something that I very much had in mind when I wrote the book. Why is the Dalai Lama always smiling? I wanted to give enough of an introduction to Westerners to some of the basic practices and sort of the context out of which they come. Not so much the cultural context, but the theoretical context and the point of view context so that people could then make an informed choice. And I also give practices in the book to road test because, as you said, I gave practices that all kind of hang together nicely. And I actually put them together in something I call the round robin practice, where you go from one to the next so that they do all come together so that people could try them on for size. They could road test them and see, how does this work for me? Is this something I want to pursue more? And then they always can. But when I was teaching for years, I was looking for an introductory book for Westerners, and I wasn't finding one that I felt was really hitting the spot for me as a teacher that I wanted to share with my students. So I blithely thought, I'll just write one. And I thought it was just going to be this little handbook. And I started writing, and it got bigger and bigger. And then I hired an editor to help me because I was a first-time author, and I felt I really need an experienced editor. And I wanted an editor who wasn't Buddhist and didn't know anything about Buddhism, who was just a good editor. Because then if he didn't understand, probably a lot of readers weren't going to understand.
Exactly.
And it turns out, there were cases where I was introducing a word, and then, 3 pages later, I explain what it is. And he says, wait a second, that doesn't work. And so that was really helpful for me as a new author and an author of something that I sort of had the curse of knowledge about. So that it was actually a whole adventure for me to write this book, and it's one of a series of 3. It's going to be altogether 3 because it did keep growing. But this is the introductory one. It is also complete in itself, which is why we could have 3 books, discrete books in the series.
As you were writing this one, did you have any aha moments or things that you learned while putting it together?
Well, I had a bunch of them. The first one was when I sat down the very first time to start writing. I wrote for at least 2 hours without pause, and it seemed like it was 15 minutes. And I stood up from it and felt so energized and excited, and it was like it was all in there waiting to come out. And there was such a deep sense of satisfaction in putting it out there on the page or in the computer, as the case may be, that I was, just sort of feeling bubbly inside. I thought, oh my gosh, this was really waiting to come out, and it just flowed. So that was the first aha. And quickly after that, the second aha was, I actually enjoy the process of writing. I didn't know that about myself. So that was an exciting, it's like you create a word, it's really, you create a thought sculpture, and words are your medium. And especially with a word processor, you can take a little of this out and put a little of that in and, put this over here and that kind of thing. So it did feel like I was sculpting a thought sculpture. It's the best way I can describe it.
It's a beautiful way to characterize it. So tell us about this sculpture, the book. What's there that would interest a Vajrayana novice or perhaps an experienced practitioner?
So for the novice, let's just start with the fact that I assumed absolutely no prior knowledge of any sort of Buddhism and Buddhist practice even. And this is really a book about Buddhist practice, not Buddhism in the sense of giving people a religion, because again, my teacher said to me right early on, which was one thing I really appreciated about him. He said, I'm giving you a set of tools, not a religion. And he never foisted, as best he could avoid it, he never foisted his culture on me. And, I have my own culture. and I'm happy with it. Whereas some people find the Tibetan culture fascinating and exotic and this kind of thing, that wasn't the pole for me. I just, wasn't interested in that. I was interested in these tools so that I could be a better, happier person. And if these were good tools and I was finding success with them, then I wanted to share them with people. And that's how I came to write the book. So I, again, wanted to offer in this book a bridge, a pathway to understanding the practices so that people could then road test them accurately, use them properly, because, the practices themselves won't do you much good if you don't know how to use them and how to understand what each one is for and that kind of thing. So I had to give some context for them, but I did it as a Westerner. I'm just giving you a quick sort of encapsulated version of what I'm offering brand new people who are just curious about this, sort of thinking, well, I had a New Year's resolution to meditate, haven't quite done it yet. Maybe I'll check out this book and see what I might do. Or just, curious about it. Then for somebody who is new to Vajrayana, I do give some background that they may or may not have been told by their teacher, particularly if the teacher is Tibetan, because I go into, for example, the 5 Buddha families, the 5 types of timeless awareness, that kind of thing, and, provide a chart. And that's kind of fascinating for a lot of us Westerners. We like those charts. As a psychotherapist, I was fascinated by that. And to look at how neurotic emotions, if we don't push them away and we don't indulge in them, but we simply peel away the layers of the onion of them, what we get down to is the pure core. And so the Vajrayana practices help us to do that, just to say that in a nutshell. So to explain that Westerner to Westerner, I think is very helpful even for Vajrayana practitioners.
Yeah, and you describe that very well in your chapter, Why I Bothered. And you're putting it, that's the one thing I appreciate in fact, most about the book is that this is not a doctrinal analysis kind of book. And it's not just particular practices. This is a human approach to what your experience has been with manifesting this in your life. And so I'm curious about what some of the feedback you've received about the book has been.
Well, you're right. I did want to just share some of my stories around doing the practices and how they were actually helpful for me in the trenches as a human being, grappling with life. And as I've been going around doing events just recently for the book, what's kind of struck me is, so I've had another aha in now the dissemination of the book. I'm somebody who doesn't sell myself well or anything like that. It's just, kind of beyond me. I'm happy to sit on my mountain in Montana and study and practice and write and go for a walk with my dogs, that kind of thing. And so I had to, go out there and do this. And before I did, actually, in a little bit of training I had with, we have somebody at Namchak who's more experienced with, she's the director of education and outreach. So we go through little rehearsals, and I would keep forgetting to mention the book because I don't think that way. So what I ended up doing was at these events was actually taking people through one practice or another. First of all, talking from the heart and telling my story and introducing a practice and inviting them to just give it a little try. So then I would lead them through the practice. These are simple practices, so it didn't take much to teach them. And I was struck by how people so appreciated having this sort of timeless moment of sort of letting the normal concerns of the day go for a little bit and sitting in their hearts and feeling some peace, just peace and quiet for just a little bit, but not by paying a bunch of money to sit on a beach and then having our minds buzzing anyway, but a real vacation, and not just a vacation from, but a coming home to ourselves in a, really palpable way. And it was sort of like water in the desert for people, because modern life, I think, is so busy and challenging, and there's multitasking, and, the digital world goes very fast, and we're all sort of plugged in. I am too. And so this is, I think, just wonderful medicine, particularly for modern America.
So you tell a lot of very good personal stories in the book too, which I appreciate as it made it more real for me. Was that difficult for you to do?
Well, it depends on which stories and where. I normally, when I teach, give examples of when I did XYZ practice or whatever, and how I was faced with some kind of painful challenge. I did this practice, and here's what happened for me and how it worked for me. Because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I was happy to share those kinds of stories. But when the editor then suggested that I begin the book with a longer narrative about my stumbling my way to Tibetan Buddhist practice, I was kind of like, what? Why? It's not about me. It's about the thing. It's kind of how I thought of it. It's about these practices. It's not about me. And he said, well, I appreciate that. That's very modest of you. But, people will want to know, especially Westerners need to understand, just from a story point of view, how did this Western woman find her way to these Tibetan practices? Because the background question is how would I find my way, and what's in it for me? And so I realized, I believe back from my being a therapist days, and certainly from the Jungian therapy in particular, that a picture's worth 1,000 words and the power of story. I understand that. So I finally came around to accepting that and wrote that earlier narrative that you referred to.
Which is wonderful because that made it very welcoming. It was hearing from another person why this is important to them and how this changed things and made a difference. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I wanted to ask if we could step into a topic that we explored a little bit before we started the interview on this idea of self and not self. And I wonder if I could just have you chat for a few minutes about that.
Great subject.
It is.
Yeah. So there are a lot of misconceptions about self, whether it exists or not, and then if it doesn't, then what the heck is going on anyway? I'm experiencing something, but yet it couldn't be both, that there's absolutely nothing, and there's just that the universe is a big vacuum, but it couldn't be both, that things actually exist, including myself, and nothingness. So, okay, now we've explored is, isn't, both, and neither. And I've just negated all of those. So no wonder it's difficult to grasp. And after a certain point, all you can do is, just what the Buddha did was, he stopped talking when people asked him about this at first. They asked him, so what is it? What's going on? And he literally remained silent, because any words he said were going to fall into one of those four things, and then it was going to be wrong, and he was going to be misleading people. And what he did instead was to give them the methods by which they could experience reality as it is on its own terms directly. We all are looking through these warped, splattered windshields at reality, and the forms we see and, the way it all looks and the way it's shaped is what we're calling reality. But actually what we're seeing is mainly the windshield. So he gave us the tools by which we could clean our windshields and eventually actually remove them altogether. And then we would just understand what it was directly. So he wasn't into proselytizing, which I really appreciated. Rather, he was into giving us the tools so that we could simply have a front row seat and understand ourselves from our own actual experience. So he didn't believe in blind faith. He didn't feel that that was worth much. But there are several different kinds of faith, but they talk about the faith of actual experience, which I would say is just knowing. I mean, when you know for yourself from actual experience, then you can't unknow something, you know. So that's more what we can depend upon.
Is there anything else that you'd care to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I want to say a little bit more about this self, no self idea from the point of view of ego attachment.
Please, yes.
Because I think a lot of people have the misconception that Buddhism is talking about, you know, getting rid of the ego, as if you could have an egoectomy. I don't
Just
think
have it removed.
yeah,
It's an outpatient surgery. So.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a specialist, but maybe not. So rather, the ego can be employed to be in service of the greater self. And I was already kind of prepared for some understanding of this because of my Jungian studies. Jung talked about self with a small s and self with a big S. So the small s self is the limited ego and identifying with just this one little speck of reality rather than all of reality. And then self with a big S is the whole thing. Now that doesn't mean that the small s self needs to go away. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It's now in context. And we're not identifying with just this one little tiny speck of reality. That's so limiting and so lonely. And I think we all want to go home in this greater sense to what I call the great ocean of sort of this pregnant emptiness, this great awareness, because this non-substantial reality that I think is at the root of all that we see is something that the particle physicists are sort of pointing at from here and there. And David Bohm was the one who was the most explicit about it, I feel. He was one of the early quantum physicists and a protege of Einstein's. Brilliant man. So he wasn't Buddhist. He wasn't, I mean, he was Jewish culturally, but, you know, he wasn't touting any sort of religion. He was just a physicist who understood that, on the quantum level, the inside, you know, inside our skin and outside of our skin looks just the same. And somehow we organize all of these tiny, tiny flecks of subatomic. They aren't even particles on that level. Not even
particles.
That's right. They were called wavicles by some physicists because were they waves? Were they particles? There was a big debate and they could prove it either way depending on the belief of the scientist. So on that level, then, how do we organize these into the forms that we understand? So anyway, the metaphor I like to use is this vast ocean, and then its nature is just to make waves, and each wave is unique. So I'm a wave, you're a wave, everything, you know, every form is a wave on the ocean in this metaphor as I'm describing it. So self with a small s is the one wave, and then self with the large S is the whole ocean. And so when I was describing this ocean metaphor to my old rabbi a few years ago, who's still alive, he's 100 years old now, he loved the metaphor. And he said that, you know, Judaism was pointing in the same direction. So here's a physicist, a rabbi, and a lama who all kind of are, and Jung, Carl Jung, pointing in the same direction, that ego can be a part of the picture, but, you know, a wave isn't really separate from the ocean. We can point to it, and there is something, a form there, but it's very ephemeral. It goes up and down, it's changing all the time, and so on. And it is certainly a part of the whole ocean. So if we can see ourselves that way, rather than identifying, ego after all means I in Latin, identifying with this little tiny speck of reality, and expand to include all of reality, the whole context, without letting go of this one wave that we're sort of focused on in this life, then I think we can live a much happier life because we're in how can I say this? Our view of reality and actual reality are consonant. And the more consonant they are, the more happy we're going to be. David Bohm was saying this too. And the more dissonant they are, the more they diverge, the more we're going to be unhappy. We're going to bump into a wall if our understanding of reality is really different from how reality actually is. Just ask somebody who was in love with somebody, but and thought the other person was in love with them, but they weren't. They bump up against that reality, and it's very painful. Just to pick a very pedestrian example.
What a beautiful metaphor. Thank you for sharing that. And for folks who are listening, if you want to find out more, there are a couple of websites you can check out. Namchak.org. That's NAMCHAK.org. And the site for the book, alwayssmiling.co. That's .co, not .com. Our guest today, Lama Tsomo. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been my pleasure. This has been a wonderful discussion.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.